I was mid-sipping my morning coffee when my hose let out a wheeze like a dying mule. Then nothing. Dry? Not a drop, which was strange since I owned the creek that feeds this entire valley. It had been a blistering 100-degree week in mid-July, and my little patch of green paradise was holding on by the mercy of the spring-fed creek that trickled past my cabin. My property sat just outside the snobby HOA called Whispering Pines, a name that sounded like it belonged on a soap label, not the collection of overly landscaped boxes filled with nosy retirees and self-appointed lawn sheriffs. I've been living peacefully for 6 years, raising chickens, growing heirloom tomatoes, and minding my own business on land my grandfather left me. That peace shattered the moment Karen moved in 3 houses down the ridge. Karen, an ex-real estate agent turned HOA president, had a face that always looked like she smelled something awful, which matched the attitude she dragged around like a purse full of lemon wedges. She had taken an obsessive interest in my property, constantly snapping pictures over the fence, calling the county about imaginary code violations, and at one point standing on a ladder just to get a better look at my compost pile. But cutting my water line during a drought, that was a new low. I followed the hose back toward the hill, trying to make sense of what happened. Something felt off. My ground was unusually soft, trenched recently. I trailed the disturbed soil like a detective, heart thumping. My irrigation system ran off a pipe that connected directly to a filtered inlet from the creek. That pipe should have been buried and undisturbed. Instead, it was sliced clean in half, zip-tied with a bright pink flag that read, "Violation removed per order." Order from whom? I scrambled down the slope toward the border between my property and the HOA zone. I passed the old oak tree that marked my side's boundary, then paused. There, standing with arms crossed and sunglasses halfway down her nose, was Karen herself, smug and sweating through her pastel sweater like she was posing for a real estate pamphlet titled "How to Ruin a Neighborhood." She didn't even flinch when I called out. I asked her what she thought she was doing, and she simply said, "You've been overwatering during a restricted period. As HOA president, I have a duty to act." I reminded her that my land wasn't in her jurisdiction. She countered with, "Water doesn't respect fences. You were setting a bad example." She turned and walked away like she just dropped the mic on a TED Talk, leaving me standing in the dirt with my severed pipe and a fury rising in my chest. That's when it hit me like a lightning bolt through dry timber. Karen had no idea. None. She had cut the very line fed by a creek that started on my land. A creek that wandered lazily through my yard, past the chicken coop, danced under my wooden bridge, and then, only then, flowed into Whispering Pines, where it watered all their artificial turf, their decorative roses, and their snobbish little golf green. They had no well, no backup tanks, just their automated HOA sprinklers entirely dependent on a water source they didn't own. I crouched near the broken pipe, chuckling under my breath. For the first time in this entire HOA nightmare, I had leverage. Real, undeniable leverage. If they wanted to start a water war, I'd gladly play commander. By evening, I'd made temporary repairs with some PVC scraps and electrical tape, enough to get the trickle going again for my own use. But the real work would begin tomorrow. First, I dug up my original property records, still sealed in a weatherproof bag inside my filing cabinet. Pages that proved 2 crucial facts. 1. My property line ended about 10 feet before the HOA thought it did. 2. I held deed rights to the spring head and natural water flow dating back 78 years. The documents were signed by the county and updated in a 2001 reassessment after my father passed. These were not fuzzy gray area guidelines. They were black and white, notarized proof that what flowed through my creek belonged to my land first. No one else could touch it without my say-so. I marked the boundary with bright orange paint on 3 old cedar fence posts and staked small flags in the soil. Anyone stepping past would do so knowingly. And next to the broken pipe, I left a little note taped to a mason jar. Water's a funny thing. It only flows where it's welcome. Early the next morning, I took a walk downstream. Whispering Pines looked different now. Lawn after lawn, once neon green and magazine perfect, had already begun to fade under the relentless sun. Sprinkler heads clicked with no water. Hoses lay limp like useless snakes, and a group of HOA board members stood around Karen's driveway, fanning themselves and pointing fingers. I saw her glance up the hill and lock eyes with me. I waved. That afternoon, a man in a tan uniform, some contractor with a county badge, walked onto my land. I intercepted him before he could get far. He said he was sent by the HOA to assess unauthorized modifications to shared infrastructure. I asked if he had a warrant. He didn't. I told him to turn around and come back with one. He did. I wasn't just going to win this battle. I was going to outmaneuver them so thoroughly that the next time they saw a hose, they'd think twice before touching it. I spent that night walking the creek by lantern, listening to the soft burble of water and the distant yapping of coyotes. In the darkness, that little stream shimmered with possibility. With the right tools, I could shift the flow into a deeper bend that bypassed their side entirely. It wouldn't be illegal. It wouldn't even be unnatural. The law said water could be diverted on private land so long as downstream rights weren't violated. But they didn't have rights, only assumptions. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan that would turn every drop of that assumption into dust. The sun cracked over the ridge like an egg frying on an iron skillet, and I was already knee-deep in the creek, wearing rubber boots and a grin. The chill of the early morning water ran around my ankles as I examined the natural split in the bedrock near the upstream bend, the same one I used to skip stones across when I was a kid. A few feet to the left, and the entire flow could be nudged away from the direction it had followed for decades. I wasn't talking about building a dam or clogging anything. Nothing illegal or unnatural. I was just giving nature a little nudge, a redirection, a gentle persuasion to bypass the high-maintenance HOA lawns downstream. The way I saw it, if they didn't want me using water from my own land, then they shouldn't benefit from it either. I started by piling a few large, flat rocks along the natural edge. Nothing that would scream sabotage, just enough to lean the flow slightly off course. Then I added a few logs, strategically placed, nothing that couldn't be explained as erosion control or even basic creek maintenance. By noon, the burble had begun shifting. It took effort, patience, and balance, but slowly, the water favored the path that curved into the woods behind my orchard instead of continuing into the culvert that led toward Whispering Pines. Meanwhile, I watched the HOA like a hawk. They were panicking but trying to keep it hidden under a layer of forced smiles and brittle community newsletters. The Monday memo was titled Responsible Water Use Tips and warned residents about drought conditions and the need to reduce non-essential watering. That might have worked if their entire identity wasn't built on lush, perfect lawns and ornamental fountains that had gone bone dry. I overheard one resident talking in the diner downtown about how her roses were shriveling and how the community koi pond looked more like a muddy puddle. Karen hadn't approached me directly since our last face-off by the pipe, but I knew she was plotting something. She didn't like being ignored. She especially didn't like being outmaneuvered, so I kept my game tight. I rechecked the boundary markers daily. I left a trail cam disguised in a birdhouse, and just to twist the knife a little, I placed a handmade wooden sign right where the creek forked. Private spring, not HOA maintained. The sign wasn't aggressive, just informative. But in Karen's world, information was the deadliest weapon you could wield. A couple of days later, I caught a new face snooping around my eastern fence. A man in a tucked-in polo shirt and chekkas pretending to admire the wild flowers while holding a clipboard. I called out and asked if I could help him. He fumbled and said he was just documenting flow patterns on behalf of a community interest group. I asked for a card. He didn't have one. I asked what agency he was with. He suddenly remembered he had an appointment elsewhere. I got a nice shot of his license plate as he peeled out down the dirt road. They were trying to document me now, build some case. Maybe they thought if they got enough blurry photos and dramatic language, they could sway someone in the county office. What they didn't realize was that I'd already sent a full file to the county myself weeks ago with GPS data, legal descriptions, and even drone footage of my land and the creek's natural path, all legally time-stamped and sealed. If anyone was operating in the gray zone, it was them. The days passed, and the HOA's panic grew. I began hearing whispers in town. One board member was questioning Karen's authority. Another had reportedly stopped paying his HOA dues in protest. I didn't revel in their misery, but I didn't feel guilty either. They cut my water without warning during a drought on land they didn't own. Actions have consequences. Then came the surprise escalation. I woke one morning to find footprints in the mud by the upstream bend. Fresh. Someone had been there during the night, fiddling around near my rock placement. Nothing major was moved, but someone had clearly tried to shift things back. That was enough for me. I added motion-triggered sprinklers connected to my barn's pressurized tank, but I didn't fill them with just water. I mixed in a bit of concentrated garlic oil and skunk scent I used to deter raccoons from my crops. It was completely safe, but the smell could strip paint. That night around 2 o'clock in the morning, the sprinklers went off. The next morning, the footage showed a familiar figure, one of Karen's board members, tiptoeing along the edge in the dark before getting sprayed head to toe. He ran off like a cartoon bandit, slipping in the mud, yelling something that got muffled by the splash of water. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my coffee. I packaged the footage and saved it just in case I needed to press trespassing charges later. By now, the OA's creek access was a ghost of its former self. What had been a gentle flowing stream was now a damp trickle with dry patches forming near the decorative bridge they built using community funds. Their prized green belt looked like a prairie in mid-August. Karen tried to hold a town hall about environmental vandalism, but stumbled when residents started questioning how the water lines were managed in the first place. Someone even asked her if she had permission to dig on neighboring property, to which she turned red and dodged the question entirely. I watched it all unfold like a theater show from the comfort of my front porch. I had a glass of lemonade in one hand and a file folder in the other, ready to go to the county again if I needed. But I didn't. Not yet. The real power wasn't in making noise. It was in letting the pressure build quietly until the people who thought they were in control finally realized they weren't even in the right room anymore. One evening, just before sunset, I stood near the edge of my orchard where the new creek path now shimmered through rows of peach trees. Birds fluttered at the edge of the water. A couple of deer had started coming down to drink. I felt something close to peace again. Not because I'd won, not yet, but because I'd reclaimed something that had always been mine, and I had done it without shouting, suing, or swinging fists. I had simply outsmarted them. And in a war of water during a drought, nothing feels more powerful than watching the other side wilt while your roots run deep. The heat rolled in heavier than ever, and by now it felt like even the flies were too tired to buzz. Every blade of grass and whispering pines looked scorched, their perfect lawns reduced to brittle patches of beige dust. The HOA newsletter no longer talked about water-saving tips. It talked about drought response teams and emergency funding requests for water trucks. That was rich, considering they still hadn't acknowledged where their water used to come from. But I wasn't concerned with their newsletter. I was concerned with the muddy boot prints I found again by the creek, only this time deeper into my property and near my trail cam disguised as a birdhouse. The footage showed Karen herself this time, standing near the edge of the newly formed bend with a man who looked like a plumber or contractor. They pointed, crouched, and then left. No damage yet, but it was only a matter of time before Karen tried something bolder. And sure enough, she did. 2 days later, I caught the same contractor elbow deep in my creek, trying to force the flow back toward the HOA culvert. He hadn't even bothered to knock or call. I calmly approached, phone already recording, and asked what he was doing. He mumbled something about redirection for environmental flow regulation. I asked who hired him. He hesitated. I asked if he had a permit. He didn't. Then I told him he was trespassing and had 30 seconds to pack up before I called the sheriff. He left in a hurry, dragging tools and dignity through the mud. I uploaded the video to the local community Facebook group, tagging it with the caption, "Just trying to protect my tomatoes." Within hours, it spread like a grass fire. Locals who had always kept out of HOA drama started chiming in. Comments flooded the post. "That's Jack's land. They have no right. Karen's gone too far this time." It was a small town, and news spread faster than wildfire when the gossip was good. The next morning, I saw 2 sheriff's cruisers parked outside the Whispering Pines Community Center. That made me smile. A couple hours later, one of the deputies stopped by my property. It was Sheriff Mills, a good man with a thick mustache and boots that had seen 20 winters. He stepped out of his truck and nodded at me with that look that said, "This town is getting crazier by the minute." He asked if I had more footage. I showed him everything: the trespassing, the contractor, the maps. He nodded, asked for copies, and assured me he'd have a word with the HOA. When I asked if Karen could be charged, he sighed and said, "Probably not yet, but one more step out of line and she'd be buying herself a hefty fine and a permanent mark on the county record." That wasn't the end, though. Karen was like a raccoon in a trash bin. Put her out one night, she'll be back the next. So I upgraded my deterrent. I installed 2 more trail cams, buried deeper and disguised better. I even hung a few old CEs from fishing line to reflect light near the creek at night, not for security, just to mess with their nerves. But the crown jewel of my defense system came in the form of a modified motion sprinkler. I'd reproposed a small tank used for crop protection and filled it with a non-toxic mixture of garlic extract, fish emulsion, and a few drops of peppermint oil. Harmless, but it smelled like something that had died twice. I aimed it right at the trail where I figured they'd come next. Sure enough, 3 nights later, the system went off. I reviewed the footage and nearly fell over laughing. Karen's top enforcer, that board member who always wore boat shoes and acted like he was too good to sweat, had walked straight into the blast. He flailed, screamed, slipped, and rolled downhill right into the mud. I didn't even need to post that one. Word got around before the sun came up. Next time I went to the general store, people offered to buy me coffee just to hear the story firsthand. Of course, Karen couldn't let it slide. The HOA issued a formal complaint to the county, claiming I was interfering with community utilities. They cited environmental concerns and accused me of hoarding a natural resource. I responded with a packet of documentation that included survey maps, water rights, deed history, and time-stamped video evidence. I mailed a copy to the HOA and handed the original to the county office. The county clerk, bless her heart, laughed as she filed it, saying I might need to frame that packet before it was over. The kicker came when Karen tried to hold an emergency HOA board meeting at the clubhouse, and only 3 members showed up. One of them resigned right after, blaming the situation for making him a community joke. Another handed out copies of the Facebook video and asked why the president was ordering illegal plumbing operations. Karen tried to shift blame, but her reputation was already tanking like a lawn chair in quicksand. Just to twist the knife a little deeper, I called in a professional land surveyor, not one from town, but a firm from 2 counties over with drones, satellite overlays, and everything. I wanted this documented beyond question. They came out, walked the property, reviewed the historical flow of the creek, and by the end of the week handed me a glossy folder that was more conclusive than a murder confession. It showed the source of the water clearly originating from within my boundaries and the path it now followed due to natural seasonal redirection and private land maintenance. I called a local print shop and had a large laminated version made. I posted it on a weatherproof board at the edge of the creek, right where the HOA trail used to dip down to admire the view. Then I added a second sign beneath it that read, "No unauthorized water access beyond this point. Violators will be recorded, reported, and possibly sprayed." That Sunday, Karen finally broke her silence. She marched right up to the edge of my property during daylight hours and called out to me like we were neighbors exchanging pie recipes. She said we needed to have a civil discussion. I told her I was civil every step of the way, and that discussion should have happened before she sent men to cut into my pipe. She huffed, said something about cooperation, and hinted she might be willing to discuss water-sharing agreements. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes, either. I simply said we'd talk when the trust she broke was restored. Until then, the creek would keep flowing wherever the land said it should. As she walked away, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Her perfect hairstyle, always so stiff and polished, had begun to frizz in the heat. Her step wasn't as sharp. Her shoulders slumped a little. For the first time, Karen looked like the kind of person who realized she might be in over her head, and I was just getting started. By the time the county clerk finished processing all the paperwork I'd submitted, the HOA was already in full-blown meltdown. The official ruling came in the form of a neat little envelope marked with a gold seal. Inside was a letter stating that my land was not, and never had been, under the jurisdiction of Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. More importantly, it clearly outlined my legal water rights as exclusive to the springhead on my property, with full autonomy over the flow and use of the creek that passed through it. I made 6 copies of that letter. 1 stayed in my file cabinet. The other 5 were posted in very visible places. 1 on the trail gate, 1 on the barn door, 1 on my front porch, 1 mailed to the county sheriff, and 1 taped to the bulletin board outside the HOA clubhouse with a sticky note that read, "For educational purposes." Within 24 hours, the Whispering Pines group chat had erupted. Someone leaked a screenshot of Karen trying to explain away the letter by saying it was temporary or subject to review. That lie fell apart quickly when a second letter from the water district confirmed that the HOA's sprinkler system, koi pond, and decorative fountains had all been drawing from the creek without any formal water-sharing agreement. The creek, as they now understood, was a gift they had taken for granted and then lost. In the following days, Karen tried every trick in her playbook. She held a special HOA meeting to vote on a legal fund aimed at suing me for resource interference. It failed. Only 7 members showed up, and 4 of them voted against the motion. One of them even stood up and said, "Maybe we should just apologize to the guy." Karen looked like someone had slapped her with a wet sponge. She turned red and adjourned the meeting with the grace of a collapsing tent. That same evening, one of the board members who had voted no sent me an anonymous email saying, "Thanks for standing up to her, and sorry it had to come to this." What really cracked things open, though, was the lawn situation. The community lawns had now crossed the line from dry to dead. HOA homes lined with brown, crunchy grass and flower beds filled with withered stems and dry soil. One woman reportedly tried painting her lawn green for an anniversary party, but the paint turned to sludge and stained her shoes. Kids stopped playing outside because the dust got into their eyes. The fancy walking paths became tumbleweed highways. The residents had had enough, and since Karen had spent months blaming me, they demanded proof that I was in the wrong. She promised she'd get it, but when she filed a formal complaint with the Environmental Review Board, it was rejected immediately due to lack of standing. No jurisdiction, no authority, no case. At that point, Karen reached out directly, not in person this time. She sent me a registered letter asking to discuss a potential water usage agreement between my land and the HOA. It was written with flowery language and vague promises about goodwill and mutual cooperation. I didn't respond, not because I was unwilling to talk, but because I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wanted to regain power by acting like we were equals at the negotiation table, but we weren't. She used her position to damage my property, publicly accuse me of theft, and send contractors onto my land without consent. She wasn't looking for peace. She was looking for control, and I wasn't giving it back. A week later, the HOA tried to pivot by hiring an independent consultant to evaluate their landscaping strategy. That backfired spectacularly when the consultant advised them to remove all grass, ornamental bushes, and non-native plants and replace everything with drought-resistant landscaping. The report said their current layout was unsustainable and borderline negligent during prolonged drought conditions. Karen tried to spin it as a forward-thinking green transition plan, but no one bought it, especially not when people had seen what my property looked like. Vibrant, well-watered, full of native trees, a garden that produced more tomatoes than I could eat, and animals drinking fresh creek water under the shade of fruit trees. Then the unexpected happened. A local news station picked up the story. Someone must have tipped them off. Probably one of the HOA residents tired of the drama. They sent a reporter out to my property with a camera crew. They asked to film a short segment on rural water rights and responsible land use. I said yes, but only if they promised to show the full story, not just a headline. They agreed. I walked them through the creek's origin point, the original deed, the documentation, and the before and after results of the HOA's interference. I even showed them the signs, the new irrigation system I built with underground pipes, and a before-drought photo of Karen's perfect lawn, now reduced to brittle mulch. The segment aired 2 nights later. It wasn't explosive, but it was clear, calm, factual, and it made Karen look like the exact kind of person she hated being seen as, a control freak who overstepped her bounds and ended up destroying the very thing she was trying to micromanage. The comments on the station's Facebook posts were brutal. One said, "This is why you never mess with farmers." Another said, "Karen needs to sit down and touch some real grass if she can find any." After that, the HOA board held an emergency vote. Karen was removed as president by a narrow margin. She wasn't kicked out, but her power was gone. The new acting president was a retired teacher named Mr. Holloway, who I'd met once at a county fair. He sent me a handwritten letter saying he hoped we could move forward with mutual respect and no further incident. I replied with a short note thanking him and included a laminated copy of the county ruling, just so we were clear. That was when I decided to finish the reroute of the creek completely. I'd only partially diverted it before to make a point, but now I spent 3 full days digging a proper channel with a rented backhoe and reinforcing it with stone, just enough to ensure that it would permanently favor the new path, one that looped through my orchard, across a low spillway, and into a naturally formed marsh away from the HOA boundary. The water still flowed, but now it nurtured only my land and the animals that lived around it. No more free rides for HOA sprinklers, no more shared resource assumptions. The land provided what it wanted to those who respected it. When the job was done, I stood by the creek and watched it flow through the trees like it had always belonged there. In a way, it had. This wasn't revenge. This was balance restored, not by force, but by boundaries and truth and a little stubbornness. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I caught sight of a lone figure standing on the far edge of whispering pines, arms crossed. Karen, watching silently. But this time she didn't say a word. It had been 3 weeks since the creek was fully rerouted, and the land had never looked better. The new path curved around the back end of my orchard, where rows of peach trees leaned into the morning sun and bees hummed lazily around the wild flowers I planted near the edge. The water flowed steady and clear, pooling naturally into a shallow basin I reinforced with smooth stones to create a kind of mini sanctuary for birds, deer, and whatever else wandered down for a drink. Every morning, I sipped coffee and watched the creek shimmer through the leaves. It felt earned, not just because I protected what was mine, but because I'd rebuilt it to thrive. The land had always taken care of me. I just returned the favor. With the immediate threat from the HOA gone and Karen officially sidelined, I turned my attention to finishing the project I had started months ago but never completed. An underground irrigation network that pulled directly from the creek and fed a slow drip system throughout the orchard and garden beds. I had sketched it on graph paper last winter while snow coated the ridge, and now, with the right tools and a little sweat, it came to life. It wasn't just about watering crops. It was about resilience, about making sure I never had to depend on anyone who didn't understand the land they lived on. I rented a trench digger, laid piping with gravity-fed filters, and connected it all to a solar-powered timing system I mounted on the side of the barn. Every drop of water now moved with intention, feeding the soil without waste. The effect was immediate. Tomatoes plumped up, squash vines exploded with blossoms, and even the usually stubborn fig tree at the back of the property looked less grumpy. I gave away extra vegetables at the weekend market, and folks kept asking how my garden stayed so lush when theirs had given up. I didn't say much, just smiled and said the soil knows who cares for it. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to recover from the mess. They'd started a new landscaping committee under Mr. Holloway's leadership and announced plans to convert the community areas into xeriscaping zones with native, drought-tolerant plants. It was a smart move but a hard sell. Some of the residents grumbled about losing their lawns and flower beds, but with water bills climbing and public pressure mounting, they didn't have much choice. The days of weekly watering and artificial turf showrooms were gone. In their place came gravel walkways, sage brush, and blue grama grass. It actually looked better than before, but Karen refused to acknowledge it. I learned from one of the HOA members at the feed store that Karen had retreated into her home and only came out for short walks, always alone, always avoiding the trail that used to run near the creek. It was strange to think of her as quiet. For months, she'd ruled that neighborhood with the authority of a dictator and the subtlety of a marching band. Now she was a shadow. No apologies, no letters, just silence. But maybe that was for the best. Some people never learn through confrontation. They only learn through consequence. One morning, I was repairing a fence post near the lower pasture when a car pulled up to the edge of my drive. I didn't recognize it, but the man who stepped out was familiar. Tall, balding, a bit sunburned. He introduced himself as a journalist with a regional magazine that covered rural development, agriculture, and land rights. Said he'd seen the local news segment and wanted to do a feature. Normally, I would have said no. I didn't like the idea of putting my business on display. But this time, I thought about the bigger picture, about the number of small landowners like me who dealt with the same issues, about how few people actually understood their rights or what could happen when those rights were ignored by people in power. So I agreed. I walked him through the property, explained the creek's natural path, showed the maps and documents, and talked about what happened in as straightforward a way as I could. He asked thoughtful questions, not about the drama, but about the land, how it had changed, what it meant to live beside a water source, how I felt when it was threatened. It wasn't about revenge or HOA politics. It was about stewardship. When he left, he shook my hand and said, "This story was one more folks needed to hear." I hoped he was right. A few days later, a brown envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a copy of the magazine already in print. The article spanned 4 pages and included photos of the orchard, the rerouted creek, and the little wooden sign I had carved that read, "Flow with respect." The writing was honest and generous. It didn't paint me as a hero or the HOA as villains. It told the truth plainly and let the reader decide. I appreciated that. Later that week, I got another letter, this one from the new HOA president, a formal one, signed and stamped. It expressed gratitude for my patience during the conflict and requested permission to invite a group of Whispering Pines residents on a guided walk near the creek to learn more about sustainable landscaping and water conservation. They offered to stay on the public trail and not enter private boundaries. It was polite, respectful, a far cry from the demands and threats that had come before. I read it twice before deciding. Then I wrote back and said yes, on one condition: Karen was not to attend. Not out of spite, but because some lines, once crossed, changed the path forever. They agreed. When the group came, it was small and quiet. A few curious retirees, some younger couples, a teenager with a sketchbook. I walked them along the new trail, pointed out the native plants, the way the soil held water better near the trees, and the importance of working with the land, not against it. They listened, they asked questions. Some took notes. One woman even teared up a little when I explained how the creek had supported my family for generations. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that felt like healing. As they left, one man lingered behind and looked out across the creek. He said, "We used to think we owned this place. Now I see we're just borrowing it." I nodded and said, "The land keeps the books. It remembers everything, good and bad." That night, as the sky turned gold and the wind carried the scent of fresh soil and blooming clover, I sat on the porch with a cold drink and watched the creek wend its way past the orchard, soft and steady. For the first time in months, everything was quiet. No footsteps, no shouting, no board meetings, just the sound of flowing water and the deep, settled calm that only comes after a storm has finally passed. The days grew shorter, and the ridge softened into autumn. The creek now curved gently past my orchard, its flow calmer than before, like the land itself had finally settled after months of tension. The leaves had turned gold and rust, and the once dry fields now pulsed with life again. Birds returned to nest in the hedges, and squirrels danced along the fences with acorns in their mouths. Everything had come back to balance, not because of force or fury, but because I had protected what was mine and let nature do the rest. I never set out to fight a war. I just wanted peace. but sometimes peace has to be earned. One cool morning, I stood beside the creek with my old dog, Tucker, by my side. He was getting slower, white showing around his muzzle, but he still followed me everywhere. We watched the water flow through the rock channel I had reinforced weeks earlier. It sparkled under the rising sun, cutting a silver path across the orchard's edge. Tucker dipped a paw in and sniffed the air. I leaned on the shovel I was holding and took a deep breath. The smell of wet earth and apples filled my lungs. It reminded me of my father. He used to say, "You can't stop water. You can only guide it." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I did. Across the valley, Whispering Pines looked different too. Gone were the emerald lawns and fancy hedges. In their place were stone gardens, native grass patches, and shaded sitting areas built from reclaimed wood. It wasn't the showy neighborhood it once tried to be, but it looked honest now, real. A few of the homes even had rain catchers and gray water systems installed. Word around town was that the new HOA president had convinced the board to fund sustainable upgrades using leftover legal funds that had been reserved for fighting me. The irony didn't escape me. The very struggle they waged against my independence had forced them to learn how to stand on their own. I received another letter that week, this time handwritten and folded neatly inside an envelope marked only with my name. The return address was blank, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Karen. The letter was brief. She apologized, not in sweeping terms or poetic language, but in a way that felt raw and uncomfortable. She said she'd had misunderstood the boundaries, both legal and personal, that she let her title blind her to the truth, that she acted out of fear of losing control and ended up losing something more important. She ended the letter by saying she had stepped down from the board entirely and would be moving away in the coming months to stay with her sister in another state. She wished me peace and signed her name with a shaky hand. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the back of my old ledger book where I kept notes about the land. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. Some wounds do not need words to close. They just need time and distance. With the season shifting, I prepared the land for winter. I mulched the beds, stored the tools, and finished reinforcing the edge of the creek with native stones I had collected over the years. I even added a small wooden bench near the widest bend, where the water pulled deepest. I carved a phrase into the backrest. Let it flow its own way. That spot became my thinking place. Some evenings I'd sit there and listen to the owls call out across the orchard or watch the stars come up one by one above the treetops. The silence was full, not empty. A silence earned through struggle and made sweeter by the resolution. Tucker took to lying near the bench, his head resting on his paws while the wind carried the scent of pine and distant smoke from someone's wood stove. He didn't move much anymore, but he still barked at the mail truck like it was a bear. And that small sound reminded me that life, no matter how much it changes, always holds on to little pieces of its old stealth. One afternoon I got a knock on the door from Mr. Holloway. He wore a clean flannel shirt and held a small basket of homemade preserves. Said it was a thank you from the HOA for the orchard tour. He stayed on the porch and didn't ask to come in, just stood there like a man who respected boundaries. He told me the board had voted to install a plaque in the community center with a quote from the article written about me, "Respect the land and it will take care of you." He asked if I was okay with that. I told him I didn't need credit, but I appreciated the gesture. Then he handed me a final envelope, this one with an official seal. Inside was a formal statement from the HOA acknowledging the overreach, apologizing for the pipe incident, and confirming the permanent cessation of any claims regarding the creek. I read it, nodded, and offered him a jar of my pickled green beans. He grinned and took it like it was gold. That evening, I lit a small fire in the pit out back, roasted a couple of ears of corn, and sat in the glow with Tucker snoring softly beside me. I thought about everything that had happened, the trespassing, the fake violations, the meetings, the threats, and how close it all came to becoming something uglier. But instead, it ended with a letter, a bench, and the sound of a creek that flowed exactly where it was supposed to. Somewhere beyond the ridge, I heard coyotes howl in the distance. The stars blinked alive one by one above the orchard, and as I leaned back in my chair and felt the night settle in around me, I realized I wasn't just watching the water anymore. I was part of it, of the land, of the balance it demanded, of the quiet strength it gave back when you listened. The fight was over, the lesson had been learned, and the flow would never be taken for granted again.